Good day, my name is Julian Benoit. I will be your lecturer today for this class on the origin of life and invertebrates evolution. As for the previous class, you can always contact me during contact hours between 8 and 3 in the afternoon. Using this email address if you have any question. My email address is also in the forum. You can also ask your questions in the forum section at the bottom of the lesson. Let's start. And as yesterday, I strongly advise that you download this video and that you take notes, even though we are not in regular lecture conditions. Taking notes will help you learn the things that I'm going to tell you today. It's going to be a bit dense, and I don't know yet if I will have to divide this video in two, just to make it a bit easier to download. Maybe I will have to divide this class in two. Okay, so the origin of life. It's no less than the title of this module, so I should tackle it right now, right in the beginning. So what do we know about the origin of life? We know that Earth was formed 4.5 billion years from now, and that the first traces of life date back from 4 billion years from now. So there's quite a lag, like 500 million years lag between the origin of Earth and the origin of life. And the first traces of life are single-celled organisms called cyanobacteria. So cyanobacteria means blue algae. It's a type of blue algae that lives on photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is how the plants use the power of the sun to create nutrients out of what they can find in the ground. So, and the cyanobacteria are capable of doing that. They are capable of using the radiations from the sun to turn them into energy to power their single cell organism. And the good thing about cyanobacteria is that we find their fossils as early as 4 billion years ago. And we find also modern cyanobacteria that are still doing the same thing they were doing 4 billion years ago. So we have a pretty good idea of what fossils of cyanobacteria should look like, because we have modern cyanobacteria. They are not dead. They are still there. So this is a picture that was taken in Australia, where some cyanobacteria still forms those big pillows that you can see here. So these pillows are formed by successive layers of bacterial mats. So the bacterial mat colonizes the top of the pillow and then die and is covered with calcium carbonate, and another mat develops, is also covered by calcium carbonate and dies, and so on, forming these pillows. And when you cut these pillows, you can see the fossilized bacterial mats that you can see here. These are these lines. So, and these pillow-shaped structures are called stromatolites. Stromatolites, it's written here. And these stromatolites, we find them up to 4 billion years from now. And in South Africa, we are lucky enough to have some of the oldest stromatolites in the world, which are no less than 3.5 billion years old, from the Barberton area, so close to the Swaziland border, and closer to Johannesburg, near Pretoria, in the Transvaal supergroup. You have the 2.5 billion years to 2.7 billion years old stromatolites. And in these stromatolites, the cradle of humankind, the caves of the cradle of humankind are formed inside these stromatolites. So the dissolution that resulted into the formation of those caves is in a 2.5 to 2.7 billion years old stromatolite formation. And you can see this is a section basically of the base of the pillow here. So you can see the different mats piled onto each other. So very, very nice nicely preserved stromatolites that you can find here in South Africa. So, and these are the first evidence of life. So life, they show that life started as single cell organism, simple organism. And these single cell organisms, as I was saying, were performing photosynthesis. So in the beginning, 4 billion years ago, early Earth had no oxygen. There was absolutely no oxygen on Earth, or very little. But photosynthesis transformed the carbon dioxide into the oxygen, O2, and released it into the ocean and later in the atmosphere. When the oceans were saturated with oxygen, this oxygen was released into the atmosphere. So, and this process took about 2 billion years. And we know that because we have traces of banded iron. So once again, from the Barberton region near Swaziland border, in South Africa, we have 3.5 billion years old banded iron formations. And what do they show you? They show you times. So the times during which the sedimentation was normal and then suddenly turned into red. So what is this red deposit? It's iron. It's oxidized iron. There was so much oxygen released in the ocean that suddenly the iron started rusting and precipitating at the bottom of the ocean. So this iron testifies, this oxidized iron, this rusty iron, tells you that there was so much oxygen released in the ocean by the cyanobacteria that at some point it could even oxidize the iron that was in the ocean. So, and you can see that this is called banded iron because you have phases of normal sedimentation, rich in iron band, normal sedimentation, another band rich in iron, normal sedimentation, another band that is rich in iron. So that's why it's called the banded iron formation. So by itself, the banded iron formation counts as a trace fossil. Now the metazoan. So what are the metazoans? The metazoans are multiple-celled organisms. So life before was only made of single-celled organisms, but about 2 billion years from now, so we are already halfway since the formation of Earth. I want to highlight this. Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago, so 4.5 billion years from now, and we are already halfway in the history of Earth, and we are only seeing the first multiple-celled organisms. So the first sign of multicellularity, organisms that are made by more than one cell. So, and the earliest evidence for multiple cell organisms come from Africa once again. So we have Discagama from South Africa, which is 2.2 billion years old, and it looks like you can see that cup-shaped organism. So it's not quite sure what it is. It's probably not related to any modern animal, but it's made of, you can see, multiple little smaller units that are cells. So it's by definition a multiple cell organisms. Also in the Transvaal supergroup in South Africa, you find burrows, traces of burrows that were made by worms, most likely. So worms are multiple cells organisms. So this is a trace fossil, an indirect evidence that a multiple cell organisms was living there. And from Franceville in Gabon, so in Central Africa, you have these very strange organisms. You can see those spiraled organisms that were discovered that are also 2.2 billion years old. So of course, these traces of life are difficult to identify because they are very old. There has been a fair amount of deformation during diagenesis. The preservation is not perfect because these are all soft-bodied animals. So the preservation is quite uncertain, but they are old enough and well preserved enough so that we know that they constitute the first evidence of complex life on Earth, and the first evidence of non-microscopic life on Earth, because you have to imagine that these stromatolites, they are bacteria, so they are microbes, microscopic animals. For the first time, animals 2 billion years ago become big enough to be seen by the naked eyes. And now we can entering the Metazoan, we can also enter the organisms that are more familiar to us, may I say. The first of them are the sponges. So sponges or porifera in if you use the scientific word. Porifera stands for sponges. So sponges is the common name, that's the scientific name. So porifera are very simple organisms, is just a cup-like animals with holes that we call pores, hence then named the porifera. Porifera, fer means bearing and pore is a pore, so that's the tiny holes that you can see on the side. And the water enters through these holes and is filtered through these holes, this pore, and is released through the big mouth that you can see at the top. So it's a very simple organization. And the oldest evidence for that organization is Otavia from Namibia, which is about 800 million years old, or 0.8 billion years, if you prefer. It's the same thing. So 800 million years old is the first evidence of porifera, and there are still poriferans living today. There are still sponges today. So the time span for porifera is 800 million years old to present. Present means today. And the ecology of porifera is quite interesting. So they are sea organisms, and they usually live in shallow seas, though you can find some sponges even in fresh water, but most of them live in shallow seas, and they often form like the coral, they form reefs, and in this case they are indicative of tropical water. If you have a reef of sponges, you're probably looking at tropical water. And what's also interesting is the energy. They are indicative of the level of energy. If you have a ramified, a very tall ramified sponge with many branches, very delicate shape like this, you're looking at a sponge that lived in low energy environment. So the water was very calm, was very tranquil. There was not much stream in that environment. But then when you move to more and more robust shape, then it means that the energy is becoming higher. It probably means that you're getting closer to the shoreline, basically. So there are more waves, the water is agitated, and this means that you cannot have this kind of shape, delicate shape. So they get smaller and more robust, thicker, and more to resist the high energy environment. So Otavia, for example, would be a high energy environment type of sponge. So they are very interesting. They are not particularly interesting in terms of dating the rocks, but they are very interesting in terms of paleoecology of the rock. Very interesting, particularly looking at the energy, and you can know from their shape if you are close to the shoreline or not. Very similar to the sponges are the cnidaria. So cnidaria is the scientific word for coral. So the cnidaria differ from the sponges. They are also very simple organisms that use that filter the waters through their pores. But the big difference is that the cnidaria have a radial symmetry. So what is a radial symmetry? It means that if you take a point at the middle of the organism, at the mouth of the organism at the top here, you will find a symmetry that goes through different axes. So, and these axes are organized in a radial way, in a radiating way, hence the radial symmetry. So it's opposed to the bilateral symmetry in which there is only one axis going through the mouth to the bottom of the animal. So radial symmetry is when the symmetry goes around, if you prefer, and bilateral symmetry is when the symmetry goes half-half, 50-50. And sponges have absolutely no symmetry, as you could see in the previous slide. So the corals are also very interesting when they form reefs because they are indicative of tropical environment, and they are like sponges. You will have shapes, different shapes depending on the energy of the water where they are found. Usually they form reefs in tropical water and they are solitary in cold water. So if you find a lonely coral or polyp, when they are lonely, they are called polyp. So if you find a lonely polyp, it means that you're looking at a cold water deposit. So all the time, when I talk about the ecology of the animal, it's not to give you a lesson in life history, it's to tell you that if you find this animal as a fossil, this is the type of environment where the rock was formed. So you find this fossil in the rock, and the rock was formed under a certain environment, and the fossil tells you what type of environment it was. If that environment was close to the shore, was away from the shore, was in cold water, was in hot water. And the chances of dating your rocks using coral is very slight because they originate in the Cambrian and they are still present today. You still have coral reefs today, including by the South African shores. But there are two types of corals that you can distinguish. One of them being more typical of the Paleozoic. So if you refer to your geological stratigraphic chart that I gave you in the previous class, so you can pause this video right now, go back to lesson 1, download the PDF, and find the stratigraphic chart. So the Paleozoic is the age of trilobites. It's the first half of the Phanerozoic. So you have a type of coral that is typical of the Paleozoic and that has a more bilateral symmetry, if you prefer. It's still a radial symmetry. You can see it's still organized into septa that are radiating from the center. So that's what you can see on this picture. The septa are these tiny walls that you can see here, and they are still radiating from the center. But if you look carefully, you will find that they are actually also bilaterally symmetrical. So it's an altered radial symmetry. You will have to be very comfortable with the concept of radial and bilateral symmetry because we will talk about it very often in this class. So yeah, the Tetracoralia or Rugosa are typical of the Paleozoic, and they are characterized by their less radial, more bilateral symmetry compared to the Hexacoralia, which are found in the Mesozoic up until today. So the Tetracoralia went extinct at the end of the Paleozoic during the Permian-Triassic boundary. And the Hexacoralia took over in the Mesozoic, and they are still present today, and they have a strongly imprint of radial symmetry. So you can see that all these septa, the tiny walls, are radiating from the middle, and they are very well organized as a radial symmetry. So now where do you find them in South Africa? Tetracoralia, you will find them in the Cape supergroup, so basically in the Cape Mountains, in the south west of the country. And the Hexacoralia are usually found in the Cretaceous of the Algoa Basin, so around Port Elizabeth, and in KwaZulu-Natal, in the KwaZulu-Natal formation. So in the Mesozoic particularly, but they are still living today. And the corals that live today belong to the Hexacoralia. And another type of basal metazoan are the Ediacaran organisms. So they are a bit of an enigma because they only lived between 800 and 550 million years from now. So this is a very narrow time span that we call the Ediacaran. So it's the very end of the Precambrian. If you remember from the last lesson, the time is divided between the Phanerozoic, which is the time when you find a lot of fossils. It's the Phanerozoic Eon. And before that, it's the Precambrian. So the Ediacaran organisms will be typical of the end of the Precambrian from 800 to 550 million years. Yeah, that time span is wrong, by the way. You have 2 times the time span. That time span here is wrong. So let me just correct that. Up, voila. So this is the right information. And these Ediacaran organisms, they lived more or less like sponges and corals, but the very difference is that most of them are bilateral, have a bilateral symmetry. So if you look at those pictures, the Ediacaran organisms from Namibia, very beautiful example of soft tissue preservation. You will see that most of them have a bilateral symmetry. So if you look here, the bilateral axis is there, here, the bilateral symmetry here, here, same thing here. So some of them have a radial symmetry like this one, but most of them are bilateral. So that's the big difference with the sponges and the corals, the cnidarian. They have a bilateral symmetry. And the best example is Rangia from Namibia. So Rangia is this one here. So now we are done with the Precambrian. So you can see the Phanerozoic, you have a time scale here. The Phanerozoic is there. This is the Precambrian here. So don't worry about Proterozoic and Archean. You just have to know that this is the Precambrian, and the Cambrian starts here at the beginning of the Phanerozoic. And now we will start looking at organisms that have an exoskeleton. They have a shell. An exoskeleton is just a big word to talk about a shell. And this exoskeleton is made of calcium carbonate. And the beginning of the exoskeleton marks also the beginning of the Phanerozoic, the beginning of the time when we start finding a lot of fossils. Why? Because now there are hard tissue around the soft tissue parts. So the chance of fossilization becomes very, very high. And this is called the Cambrian explosion, because we suddenly start finding a lot of fossils. Suddenly, our reconstruction, you can see here, we are just before the Cambrian here, looking at the Ediacaran organisms from Namibia, and you can see that's a reconstruction of the paleo environment. It's very empty, and suddenly the reconstruction of the paleo environment becomes crowded. So that's exactly the reflection of the Cambrian explosion. Suddenly we find a lot of fossils. And this is correlated with a peak in oxygen production. So you have the production of oxygen here, and you can see that suddenly in the Cambrian, the oxygen level reaches the same level as it is today. So there's a peak in oxygen productions that was in favor of the diversification of life. So it's the explosion of animal diversity. And in South Africa, you can see the Cambrian. You can see the beginning of this of the Cambrian in the Cape supergroup. So the Cape supergroup is those three colors that you can see, that's all the areas that are colored with these three colors here. So as I was saying, this roughly corresponds to the Cape Fault Belt, the Cape Mountains, from Port Elizabeth here to the Bockveld, to the Cederberg area over there. So, and this marks also, the Cambrian explosion marks the beginning of the Paleozoic, which is the age of the trilobites. So on your time scale, this is the return of the time scale. The Cambrian is here. The Cambrian explosion is there 440 million years from now. And now we will be looking at the beginning of the age of trilobites, so Cambrian, Ordovician, and Silurian first. So the mollusks. The mollusks, as the name indicates, have a soft body. That's what mollusks mean. It means soft body. They have a soft body, but with a hard shell, a hard external shell, so an exoskeleton. And in this particular case, it's made of two valves, or one valve or two valves. So the valves are the piece of shells that you find on your mollusk. So if you look at an oyster, there is one valve on the top and one valve on the bottom. And if you look at a snail, for example, there's only one valve. There's no other half to this valve. So there's only one valve. So the pieces of shell are called the valves in mollusks. And these mollusks can live fixed or not. So oyster lives fixed on the ground. They find a piece of rock and they just never move from there, which means, so that's why what fixed means. And snails, for example, they move all their life. They are not fixed. And what's interesting when you look at mollusks, particularly sea mollusks, marine mollusks, is you look at the shell, and once again, you will find that those that live in a high energy environment, like oysters that live on the seashore, they have a very thick and very robust shell, while those living in more like tropical lagoons in a very calm environment, in low energy environment, they will have ornamented shell. So they will have ornaments, spikes, and other type of ornaments on their shells. And the shell is more delicate. It's very thin, actually. So same thing with mollusk. You will have those one that indicates a high energy environment and a low energy environment. And this is applicable to all mollusks. So it's not only the oyster and the sea snail. All the mollusks that I'm going to present to you now show the same trend. The high energy one with the thicker shells and the low energy ones with the most delicate shells. And the first and most important class of mollusk that you can talk about during a paleontology class is the cephalopods, because the cephalopods left behind them a very, very rich fossil record. So how do you identify a cephalopod? So cephalopods are your octopuses, your squids. In South Africa, you're lucky enough to have the argonaut. So the argonaut is that funny squid that live inside a coiled shell that you can find if you're lucky enough during their reproductive season on the seashore. And so what characterizes cephalopods is that they have a segmented valve with multiple chambers. So if you look at the shell of a cephalopod, you have one shell, one valve, and this valve has chambers separated by sutures. So you can see the chambers, and the chambers are separated by lines of sutures or septa or walls, if you prefer. So that's typical of cephalopods. So the argonaut, for example, has the same type of shell than you can see here. This one is from a nautilus. I will show you a picture a bit later when we'll talk about them. And so superficially, it may look, this is a section. So we are looking at the inside of the shell, but the shell from the outside look like this or like this. So superficially, it may look, maybe I can show you. Yeah, this is the Nautilus here. So superficially, the shell may look like that of a snail, but the difference with a snail is the coiling. The coiling is called planispiral, which is a very fancy word to say that it's not conical. So instead of having a conical shell, cephalopods have a flat shell. So I can show you, yeah, like this. You see, instead of having the center of the coil forming a cone, the center of the coil is inside the big turn of the shell, which makes which makes the shell flat. So it's a planispiral coiling. It coils in a flat plan, if you prefer. It's not conical. So these are very, very fancy words just to say that the shell of a cephalopod has chambers inside, that the chambers are separated by suture lines, and that the shell is overall not conical. So there are, unfortunately, most modern cephalopods don't have any shell, except for the Argonauts and the Nautil. So there's very little example of modern cephalopods with a shell, but in the past, they had big shell, massive shells, and they have left a significant fossil record, probably the most significant of all the fossil records among invertebrates. So they are very, very abundant. They are all sea creatures, open sea creatures living in, they are swimming, basically, swimming animals. And their time span from the Ordovician to present. So it's one of the few invertebrate groups that does not originate in the Cambrian like everyone else. All the invertebrate groups originated in the Cambrian, except for the Ediacaran species, and the cephalopods. So cephalopods originated a bit later than the other invertebrates. And the classification of cephalopods we will see is based on the suture lines, so the lines that separate the chamber. So we will look at that in the next 15 minutes. So the first group of cephalopods, so now you can see why taxonomy was important. I'm digressing now, but you can see why taxonomy was important. So we looked at the higher rank taxonomic unit, the cephalopoda. Another high rank taxonomic unit, no, the high ranked taxonomic unit is Mollusca. Another higher rank taxonomic unit is Cephalopoda. And inside the Cephalopoda, we are looking at the lower rank unit, which is Nautiloidea. So you see the boxy, it's a box within a box within another box. So now you understand why I had to talk about taxonomy. Because if you cannot understand that Nautiloid is a box inside the cephalopod box inside the Mollusca box, then you're completely lost. Okay, so if you don't understand that, go back to the previous lecture and look again at the video about taxonomy, because this is really, really important that you don't get lost by those titles here. Those heads, paragraph headings. So now the nautiloid among cephalopods. So we are talking about the animals with a soft body that have a shell that is planispiral and that has chambers that is segmented. And now we are looking at the nautiloids. So the nautiloid are those cephalopods in which the suture lines are the simplest. So the suture line is just one wall and that's it. We will see that it becomes a lot more complex with later species, but in Nautiloid, the suture lines are very simple. And there is one tube that goes through every chamber so that the chambers can communicate with each other. And that tube is called the siphuncle. And this siphuncle, as you can see, is located right in the middle of the wall. So it's called a central siphuncle. It's in the middle of the wall. And same thing, this feature will change. If I'm talking about this feature now, it's because it's going to change in later species. So nautiloid also live in the open sea. They are predators, they are carnivores. And we can distinguish in terms of use as index fossil for correlating strata, because that's what we are looking for. You can distinguish two families, the orthocerids or orthoceres. The orthoceres are have a straight shell, and the nautiloid have a coiled shell. So you can use enrolled or coiled. I don't mind. You use the word that you are the most comfortable with. Enrolled or coiled shell means a nautilidae, and a straight shell means an orthoceridae. And why is it interesting for a stratigraphic purpose? It's because nautiloid are only known from the Triassic to present, so they are typically Mesozoic and Cenozoic, and you can see that the nautils are still alive today. This is a modern nautil. And the orthocerids are completely extinct, and they went extinct in the Triassic. So basically, there was a takeover of the coiled nautilidae over the straight shell orthocerids in the Triassic. So Ordovician from Triassic. So if you find an orthocerid, you know that you have the best chance to be in the Paleozoic. These ones, you can see, are orthocerids from Morocco. They are Triassic. So be careful. In Africa, we do have orthocerids that survived to the Triassic. But you can see they have the typical nautil morphology, which is the suture lines. You can see the suture lines indicated by the green arrow here, which is straight, and you can see it everywhere on these animals. And you can see the siphuncle. So these things, the siphuncle, which is in the middle of the wall. So you have the complete wall here, and it's in the middle of the wall, like in the coiled nautilidae. So animal with a soft body, with a segmented shell. If the sutures that separate the segment is straight, and you have a central siphuncle, it's a nautiloid. And if the shell is straight, it's an orthocerid. And if the shell is coiled, it's a nautilid. You see, that's your identification key. That's how you're supposed to work. You work from the broadest to the narrowest taxonomic unit, and you use the morphology, you use the morphological characters to identify your fossil to the narrowest point. So this is very important for the quiz part. During the quiz part, you will have some species to identify, and you will. I want you to work this way, to go from the broadest to the narrowest possible identification, so that you reach the correct answer at the end. So now the other group of cephalopod is the ammonoid. So we were talking about the nautiloid, simple suture, central siphuncle. Now we look at the ammonoids, complex sutures, and ventral siphuncle. So the ventral siphuncle means that the siphuncle doesn't run in the middle of the shell, it runs on the side of the shell, directly against the shell. And it's called the ventral side because the aperture is there, so that's where the head was located, the body of the animal was located. So that was the upper side, and that was the ventral side. The ventral side is the side of the belly. So the upper side is the back, and the ventral side is the bottom. And so the ecology of ammonoids was more or less the same. So you cannot really distinguish any different type of ecology based on ammonoids or nautiloids. They have the same ecology. They are open sea predators. But the ammonoid has a much higher diversity. Instead of two major families, like in the nautiloids, you have four major families in the ammonoids. Actually, there are